Thrilled to be here. As the kind introduction mentioned, my name is Chelsea Perino. I'm the Managing Director of Global Marketing and Communications at the Executive Center, which is one of the largest premium flexible workspaces in Asia. We have over 135 offices across the APAC portfolio. And so today I'm really excited to talk to you about the idea of flexible working and the role that it plays in corporate real estate strategy, but also how that impacts people's job satisfaction, connection, and productivity. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and let's get started. Adapting to flexible working, workspaces that adapt to changing business strategies. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So to set the stage, I thought it would be nice to first take a step back and look at some of the trends that are happening in today's current market. I know that this stat has been thrown around a couple of times already, but here we see it again, which is this concept that 30% of all of the office market globally will be flexible by 2030. I mean, that's a pretty staggering number considering that, even 10 years ago, the concept of flexible working didn't really even exist. And within this idea of this 30% flexible market, we're looking at a couple of different trends that are really impacting that. The first is this idea of urbanization. So the concept that the global population is concentrating itself in cities. Cities are starting to expand, and also the development of these secondary CBDs are coming into play in a lot of different locations. That really impacts the way they work, where they work, and how they connect. The second is this idea of technology. Of course, there have been a lot of really interesting sessions already about different kinds of technologies and how they're facilitating better working, especially within this really interesting time that we're in right now, where we're being challenged to rethink how we interact and the different kinds of systems that we use to do that, because a lot of us are working remotely, working at home, not having access to the same sorts of systems that we did in the past. And of course, this idea of flexibility, not just the idea of agility, but also having to be able to create different work environments, maybe at your house or at a coffee shop or somewhere that isn't your traditional office. So what can corporates use, and how can organizations start to think about the idea of flexibility in a positive way as a way to reinforce and create different work streams and allow people to work in a way that's best for them, as opposed to looking at it as a challenge or a detractor to productivity. And then this all kind of wraps up in this idea of the changing workforce. So how do we create environments that attract new talent, that keep talent that we have in our organizations and make them want to stay longer, and at the end of the day, increase productivity for organizations? So that's sort of the framework that I want to think about this idea of flexibility as a larger concept. So let's talk about the flex market, right? It's evolving so quickly, and it's sort of been expedited by the coronavirus situation. It's changing what people want. They have new expectations of their workforce. They're being forced to think about where they work, what are the environments, and what are the sort of resources that they need to be able to work in these different places that they hadn't necessarily had to do so before. And this also, of course, goes back to that idea of retention and the facilitation of growth within your own organization. There are some interesting stats down here, 40 to 60% of workplace interactions are with office neighbors. That's really being challenged right now if you're working from home. So what are some of the strategies that need to be put into place to continue that sense of belonging and to allow organizational change and connections to continue to happen when people aren't actually in an office? 72% people say that effective team communication has been more important over the past 2 years than ever. How is that being affected now with everything that's happening in the current market, right? We need to be able to think and utilize all of these technologies that people have spoken about already to help our employees to stay connected with one another and with the organization. 67% of senior executives plan to maintain a leader organization through the use of contingent workforce, right? That's an interesting concept because it means that people are going to be segmented, decentralized, and not necessarily all working in the same place at the same time. And the last stat, 67% of businesses globally are choosing forms of flexible workspaces. That's very, very different than the past 5 years, So there's this adaptation to the idea of having a hub and spoke model, which I'll talk about a little bit in the next couple of slides. So now, kind of coming back to look at the current business situation. We're under a time of stress, right, and duress. It's really challenging for organizations to continue to function in a very different environment than even what we were dealing with in 2019, right? And with all of these unknowns and uncertainties in the marketplace, decision makers are really trying to stabilize their business. From a cost perspective, they're really trying to save money, right? Trying to understand where are the opportunities for financial and operational streamlining. And to underlie this whole concept is business resilience, right? How do you create an environment where your business can continue to succeed even when there are such challenges out there in the marketplace? But then, of course, on the other side, there's also this disruption in personnel and personal workflows, right? People are working remotely probably for the first time for a lot of you. And this is definitely a challenge to organizations. What are the kinds of resources that they need to have in place to be able to equip their employees to be able to be productive, but also to make sure that they're still satisfied when they don't have access to all of the resources that they did before? So there are a couple of different things that play into this. The first is this idea of infrastructure. Do employees have the tools and the access that they need to be able to be efficient in a workplace outside of the office? Are they able to maintain a balance between work and life? I know a lot of us are not tied to the 9-to-5 workday anymore. At least the last time I went to the office at 9 and came back at 5, I don't know if I ever have done that before. And so this idea is now being challenged even more when suddenly your workplace is at your home. How do you create that line? And how can employers really help to maintain that balance for their employees? And then the last, of course, is this idea of community. I've been in lots of different conversations with people over the last couple of months that, and one of the biggest challenges that people working from home face is this idea of connection. How do you stay in touch with the people that are a part of your team? And sometimes more importantly, the people that aren't directly a part of your team, those ideas and the conversations and the inspiration that come from those informal actions when you're having a coffee or right after you've walked out of a meeting room and you say, oh, hey, did you think about that? You know, those aren't happening in an organic way anymore. So how can we adapt to that? And the idea of workplace strategy, because of all of this, is changing. So this matrix, I think, is really interesting because on the left-hand side, you have an organization or a person actually's ability to work remotely, right? Are they physically able to do that? Can they work? Do they have the infrastructure they need? And then on the bottom axis, you have the willingness to work remotely, right? So on the bottom left-hand corner, you're looking at somebody who is really not excited to work remotely for lots of different reasons, right? There's too many distractions. Perhaps they don't have a solid Wi-Fi infrastructure. They don't have the ability to have an office space that's different from their bedroom, for example, or their living room. They have lots of kids, or they live with family members, or they have dogs. I mean, there are a lot of different factors that make people unwilling to work from home or unable to do so, right? And then on the top right-hand corner, you have this concept where flexible working is an integrated part of a workplace strategy, right? It's championed by organizations, and not only is it championed, it's actually facilitated. So businesses are creating these opportunities for employees to work in different locations and creating the systems and the resources that they need to be able to do that efficiently. So I want to go through a couple of really interesting stats that I found when I was putting together this presentation. So the first, this is from PwC's remote work study that took place in June of this year. So the first question that they asked is, how often did you work remotely before COVID-19 happened? And how often would you like to do so once COVID-19 is no longer a concern? As you can see in this graph, on the left-hand side, you have, I didn't work remotely, and you're looking at almost 40%, right? Moving over to 5 days per week, you're looking at less than 20% post or pre-COVID, excuse me. Look at how that's changed post-COVID, right? It's a really interesting dynamic to see this shift from people that didn't work remotely to people that are really interested in working remotely once COVID, is no longer a concern. And I think that this is a trend that we're going to see. 72% of office workers would like to work remotely at least 2 days a week. And I think there will be some conversations that are taking place about what is that optimum number, right? Do you want to work from home all 5 days of the week? Do you want to work in the office all 5 days? Or do you want to find that balance? And I think that this is kind of where the direction that a lot of people are going. One of the interesting tensions that I found is that a lot of times people that never worked remotely in the past kind of championed that as the ultimate goal. They want to be fully flexible and not be tied to an office. But then suddenly, when everybody was forced to work from home, the tune really changed. And people said, you know what? There were so many things about working in an office that I took for granted. And the majority of that actually had to do with the interactions that came between people and their coworkers. So I think where we're moving to after COVID is no longer a concern is the opportunity and the desire to have this sort of hybrid model. So the next question they asked were, what % of your office employees do you anticipate will work remotely at least one day a week? Before COVID is what you see on the very far left. You have few, many, and most in these three different categories. And pre-COVID, you saw about 40%, right? Post-COVID, you're looking at most, right? Which is really, really interesting. So I think that organizations are also starting to rethink what is that optimum balance. And they're thinking about it from two different angles, right? The first is from an efficiency perspective, because suddenly organizations are saying, wait a second, if people have been working from home for the last 6 weeks or 6 months or 3 months, do we really need all of this real estate? And then the second arm is, are people actually happy working from home, or is this going to be detrimental to their productivity? And so let's talk about that for a second. Before we get into that though, this is actually from the poll. Thank you to those of you that actually answered it. You can see it on the left-hand side of the screen. It says polls, and it's one of the questions that we actually asked, which is, what is the likelihood of using a flexible workspace in the next 6 months? And as you can see, 35% said, I'm highly likely to use a flexible workspace or amenities, and 21% said that they might. So I think that it's reflected in our own audience here. People are really starting to reconsider what they need and whether this kind of hybrid model is something that's interesting and worth consideration. So I think that's a really different sort of perspective. And if we had done this poll, even 6 months ago, I think that the result would have been quite different. So if you haven't filled out the poll, please pop on over there after the presentation is done and let us know what your thoughts are about flexible working. We'd be really interested to hear from you. So I think that there are a couple of key takeaways, and the overall insight is that flexible work week and flexible working definitely is here to stay. Office workers say that they'd like to have the option to work from home, but they also need help creating those boundaries between work and life, like we talked about, the balance. People and employers need to prepare for these flexible work weeks and create different spaces for their employees to be able to do that, but also create the resources and the systems that they'll be able to use to be able to continue to be productive. Number three, even though flexible working is changing and remote working is here to stay, the office is also not going away. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember, is that the office creates a space for people to innovate. And there are a lot of things that come from being in an office environment that you can't really replicate if you're working remotely. So I think this hybrid model is where a lot of people are kind of headed. And then the last one is that while 30% of executives foresee the need for less office space, 50% are actually anticipating an increase because of these new social distancing requirements and government regulations that may actually require more space for perhaps a smaller number of people. Okay, so let's talk about flexibility, right? Why flex? Why is this a useful strategy to employ and something to think about in the future? Well, first off, it provides employees with choice, right? So we're talking about it from a personnel perspective. They're able to choose the environments that suit the tasks that they need to do in that particular time. Whether it's access, whether it's safety, the ability to be mobile, or just the inspiration of working from a different environment are all benefits from a personal perspective about why flexibility is valuable. So from a location perspective, not having to travel, right? Reduce travel times, or the ability to have this hub and spoke model. Increased productivity through activity-based working. So whether you're sitting in your own desk to do that deep thought, right? That thinking where you need to sit and you need to concentrate, or you want to be in a more collaborative environment where it's perhaps a bit more informal, where you can talk to different people. And then the diversification of real estate, such as this core and flex model. And then safety and connection, right? So the idea that you have choice. Choice is a really empowering thing for employees, and giving them the opportunity to say, today I don't feel like necessarily commuting to go to the office. I want to work from, one of the spokes or work from home, is something that's really a positive impact on employee satisfaction. But then at the same time, lose that face-to-face interaction with your colleagues, which we found to be one of the most important things that people are missing right now. And then, of course, this idea of access to the systems and information that could potentially be challenging if you had to work from home the whole time. So it's really this sort of combination of in-office experience and also working in a flexible environment. So why flex from an operational perspective? Is it provides unique solutions that address COVID, but also will be impactful and beneficial even when COVID goes away, which is hopefully very soon. The idea of decentralization, increased agility, decreased CapEx, the diversity of your portfolio. These are all things that flexible real estate are able to help you achieve. So from a financial perspective, if you're trying to save, seeking alternatives to cash-heavy investments with short-term leases is a really valuable tool. Trading CapEx expenditure for operational expenditure, for those of you that work in finance, this is a huge bonus, and flexible working is a great way to reduce your capital expenditure. And then, of course, the reallocation, of administrative costs. So not having to pay for people to clean your office, to have a reception, those kinds of things are also benefits. And then location from a cost saving perspective, the hub and spoke model means you pay for the space that you need at the time. So whether your company is scaling up or scaling down, you can really adapt in quite an agile and quick way to those needs, as opposed to trying to predict, especially in times when those kinds of predictions are quite uncertain. Access to multiple locations creates opportunities to meet new people and create new partnerships, which is great for business. And then, of course, the diversification of your real estate footprints, it builds efficiencies across the board. So when we're thinking about times of economic challenge in general, you kind of have this wave, right? You have the first, say the economy is increasing, and then you hit this trough, like what we're facing right now. During these declines, companies are valuing short-term contracts because they can reduce or increase their footprint as they need, as opposed to being tied to long-term leases. When you hit the very bottom, that's when you need to be the most cost efficient, right? But then as the economy starts to recover, companies can then incrementally scale back up as their business starts to recover at the same time, right? And then long-term, companies are able to mitigate risk when they have this flexibility incorporated into their real estate strategy. So this is just an example of how you can save quite a lot of money if you integrate Flex into your portfolio. For this example, we're talking about something like 80 workstations with a 36-month lease term, but with potential growth, right? So if you're looking at a traditional lease, you're paying quite a lot of money upfront for the entire duration, whereas if you start with a flexible lease or you're incorporating some of that into your strategy, it's more of an incremental growth. Okay, so how can we start to think about integrating this idea of flexibility, whether it's with a flexible workspace provider like the Executive Center or just within your own portfolio, into your workspace strategy? I like to call this the local feedback loop, especially if you're a global organization and you have lots of different offices that are in lots of different locations. This is really important. Like I said, we have 135 offices. So for me, I'm always thinking about how can we create this constant loop of communication with all of our different managers and sales teams that are in these different locations. Creating an overarching global strategy where you're looking at the brand's organizational capabilities and the vision and the mission, and all of the research that's done at sort of a headquarter level gets disseminated down to the local level and then gets adapted. The cultural understanding, the cultural aspect of that is really important, right? Because having an overarching umbrella brand is really important. But if you just take that cookie cutter approach and apply it all over the world, it's not going to be as effective. So the regional adaptation is really important. And then the deployment, of course. And then when you come into the bottom, it's the analysis and the recommendations for improvement that the feedback comes back up to HQ, and then you can start to readapt. So this is the strategy that we apply to all of our locations and all of the consulting that we do for our clients when they're thinking about, how are we expanding? How do we want to design the offices? We go back through this system over and over again of reinvention. And there are a lot of new channels that have developed. Some have been around for a long time, and some are being reevaluated and readapted as we speak, that are helping companies deal with this idea of agility, right? Whether it's video conferencing, like we're doing right now, a virtual conference. First time for me, pretty awesome. Utilizing email and different sort of web systems a lot more heavily than we did before. Participating in online events, whether it's conferences, but also webinars and having Zoom calls and these kinds of things. But some of the softer sort of communications and qualitative stuff like surveys, in center for us in our offices, in office communications, things like mentorship programs and business continuity plans that help create a foundation of success for your employees. So what are some of the next opportunities? Well, there's this idea that there's a new model for how we work. Businesses that previously discouraged working from home are reevaluating that validity and are starting to think about how they can create new plans and new procedures that will allow businesses to and their employees to stay connected and stay productive. Increased focus on technology. I think there are a lot of great resources out there within this conference for you guys to think about. And then, of course, this idea of connection. So how do we maintain that interpersonal relationships, both with our teams, with our managers, et cetera. The executive 27,000 members. If you have any questions about flexible workspace, please shoot me an email or visit our booth in the expo center of the conference. And I think I'll open it up to questions, right?
We have one question on the from the audience. I'd like to take that. And I also have the conference chairman, Andy Swan, who would like to ask a question. He is online with us. Let's take this from the audience. Raymond Chan asks, what are some of the immediate changes you've seen to the flexible workplace market?
Wow, that's a loaded question. It seems simple, but there are lots. I think immediately what we've seen is the adaptation of new health and safety protocols and policies. So the idea of creating flexible spaces that adhere to social distance policies, temperature checks, travel documentation when you come into different offices, hygiene controls. So whether that's, for example, in our offices, I'm not wearing a mask right now, but that's because I'm in a private meeting room. If I were to go out into the collaborative co-working area, I would be wearing a mask, and everybody that's in there is required to wear a mask as well. Having hand sanitizer available to all of our members. Those are some of the immediate changes, but I think also from a larger perspective, just the interest from organizations that were typically considered more traditional has increased, right? So people are really starting to think about how this idea of flexibility can be integrated into their workforce because they're kind of being forced to do that, right? And then the last part is this idea or this sort of re-excitement or re-evaluation of the value of an office. Because like I mentioned before, people were working from home. They thought that was a really fun experience, but then all of a sudden when they were forced to do it for 6 months, it became way less productive and way less exciting. So I think that from an employee perspective, there's this excitement about coming back to the office, which I thought was really interesting and not what I necessarily expected.
Right. Can we go to Andy? Andy, if you can turn on your video and
I'm here.
Yeah.
Hi, Chelsea. Thank you so much for such a great talk. Really enjoyed it, and I just actually want to pick up on the point you just finished on there, and this idea that we had this kind of sudden, we can work away from the office and everyone can be remote, and now people are gradually kind of realizing the benefits of the office. And one thing I'm really interested in, you mentioned the word inspiration a lot. And we've talked about human connection and we hear the words innovation and creativity. I was just wondering your perspective. Do you think if less people are in a physical location like an office or another location, do you think they lose that chance for serendipity, the chance conversations that spark an idea that maybe with a colleague they may not otherwise work with, maybe it's by the coffee machine or in a hallway or just in a chance conversation. Is there a value to that, and are we at risk of losing that if we move away from working together in offices?
Absolutely. It's really funny you brought that up. I was just having a conversation yesterday with some colleagues that I'm doing a presentation with next week or the following week, I think, about that exact idea. We call it the touchdown spot, and it's those, exactly like you mentioned, those informal conversations that you have sort of by chance that are facilitated just by being in the same physical space with someone else that often result in a really brilliant idea. We like to call it a genius, right? All of a sudden, that's sort of removed because every conversation you have is already orchestrated and facilitated, right? So one of the things that we continue to think about is if we're in this work from home environment, I live in Hong Kong, so we aren't working from home here. Some organizations are, we aren't, and a lot of organizations aren't either. So luckily, we still have the ability to interact with our colleagues in person. But if you're working from home for an extended period of time, one of the questions we're asking is, how do you create opportunities for those sort of impromptu conversations? And I was saying to my colleagues the other day, it's so funny because the idea of picking up the phone and calling one of your colleagues just to say, hey, I had this idea, or hey, how are you? For a lot of people now feels really weird. Like you have to have an intent to call a colleague. You wouldn't call them like you would call your friend just to, have a casual chat and say, hey, how's your day? And I think that's one of the things that people are really starting to miss. So sorry, the short answer to your question is, yeah, I think it's really a challenge if you don't have the office environment to maintain those kinds of connections, especially with people outside of your team. That's why I think that moving forward, this idea of the hybrid model is going to be really, really valuable, and people are going to start thinking about that quite a lot.
On that note, a very quick answer to this one question that has come up from Vigneshwaran. While I see the benefits of flexible working, I am not sure how bigger companies see this as traditionally. Office space buildings are seen as an extension of the company image, reputation, etc. What is your comments on this? A quick one.
I definitely think that offices are an extension and a reflection of a business ethos. For the executive center, that's why if you went into any of the common areas, or if I wasn't here presenting, you wouldn't see our branding anywhere, exactly because of that, right? We want the office to feel like an extension of all of our clients that have offices with us. And I think that while we are a flexible office space provider, the idea of flexibility isn't just tied to flexible workspaces or co-working spaces or whatever you want to call them, right? The idea of flexibility can be integrated into a traditional office, which means like you have your hub somewhere and then you have a smaller touchdown office somewhere else, right? So I think it's a much bigger concept. It's the idea of identifying what are the needs of your employees, what kind of work are they doing, and what are the spaces that they need to be able to do their best kind of work, right? Because I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind is nobody is doing just one job for the 8 hours, 9 hours that you're at the office, right? Now, everybody's doing a lot of different things. And it's easy to just assume that the same space facilitates the best work for all of those different tasks, but that's actually not true, because sometimes you need to do that deep thinking where you need a quiet space where you can focus, but then sometimes you need a big open area where you can sit down and feel less formal and just kind of look around or have those casual conversations like Andy was mentioning, right? So thinking about how does the flexibility within your own office work is also really important.